As Historic Columbia's Director of Operations, Jeffrey Richardson oversees the implementation of daily activities across Historic Columbia's 6 historic sites and 14 acres of manicured landscapes. Prior to joining Historic Columbia in 2022, Richardson worked at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles, the Farmington Museum System in New Mexico, and the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History located outside of Atlanta. He's written books and articles on a variety of topics, including Colt, the Revolver of the American West, and Howard Hughes and the Creation of Modern Hollywood. He has also appeared as an expert commentator on numerous programs such as Mysteries at the Museum, Pawn Stars, Storage Wars, and History Detectives. In addition to his role as the Director of Operations, Richardson is currently serving as Acting Executive Director of Historic Columbia. In today's presentation, Richardson will provide an overview of his career to show how it will inform his tenure as Acting Executive Director. Throughout the program, please put any questions or comments for Jeffrey into the chat. These questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation, time permitting. And with that, I turn our program over to Jeffrey.
I want to thank everyone very much for taking the time to be with us here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. All right, give me 1 second to get it up. All right. Thank you, everyone, for getting. I want to get my screen up and loaded. My name is Jeffrey Richardson. I am the Director of Operations here at Historic Columbia. I have also been serving for the past few weeks, about a month and a half, as Acting Executive Director. As many of you know, our long-term dedicated director, Robin Waits, recently retired from the organization after 20 years of service to the community. And as you can probably imagine, if you do know Robin, that is a significant shoes that need to be filled. And the Historic Columbia Board of Trustees is taking that task very seriously. And they are in the process of a very thorough national review to find the absolute best candidate to lead us here at Historic Columbia. And as a result of that process and making sure that we get the absolute best candidate to lead this unique and wonderful organization, I am stepping in the temporary position as Acting Executive Director in this transitional period to ensure a smooth transition from Robin, who left late in June, until the new director comes on board. So as part of the Knowledge at Noon series, we had this particular slot slated for the new executive director, and thinking that there was a possibility that they may be on board at this particular time. But because of the transition, we wanted to let you know what was taking place at Historic Columbia. So we decided to keep this particular presentation about what's taking place right now, the transition, and the leadership at Historic Columbia. So I am here today to talk to you a little bit about myself, to talk to you about my career and how that career will inform my leadership as both Acting Executive Director and my continuing role as Director of Operations. We're going to kind of go through this. I've come up with a few themes as opposed to doing in just a chronological narrative to, again, kind of show you some different projects that I've worked on that I think are interesting for a variety of different reasons. But I want to step back a little bit, and I want to kind of talk to you about my introduction to museums and really what spurred me to get into this particular industry. When I was in elementary school, my father worked for the federal government, and we lived in a suburb outside of Washington, D.C. And we traditionally would go into D.C. and we would visit the museums and the cultural sites. It was a common weekend occurrence for us. And it was something that I took a lot of pride in. It was something that I very much enjoyed as a child. But I was very young and, was kind of bouncing around, and we would go in museums. Ooh, look at that. Look at that. That's neat. That's cool. And just kind of bounce around. And my dad was doing his best to try to corral myself and my siblings as we were going through these. And one time we were at the Smithsonian's American History Museum, and I was bouncing around, seeing everything. And then I turned the corner and I saw it. And at first, I couldn't comprehend. I was probably 8, 9 years old, and it took me by surprise a little bit. But as I got closer, I realized I was looking at what I thought I was. And what I saw was Arthur Fonzarelli's jacket on display. Now, I was a huge Happy Days fan. That was one of my favorite shows. I really enjoyed it. And of course, my favorite character was Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz. Fonz. And, Fonz was one of these kind of, all guys wanted to hang out with him. He was popular with the cool kids, the nerds. Everybody liked Fonzie. Fonzie got along with everybody. The girls liked Fonzie. It was, again, Fonzie was just the coolest person on television. And I just really kind of was emblematic. And he rode a motorcycle. But he also had that leather jacket. And when I saw that leather jacket on display, I immediately turned to my father and I said, hey, that's a jacket just like Fonzie's. And he said, no, no, read the label. And I said, okay. And I looked at the label and I was like, wait, are you saying that this is Fonzie's jacket? And my dad said, yes, that, Fonzie would have donated it to the museum and it's on display for people to see it and enjoy it. And it was one of those moments in my life where it was like, oh my goodness. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I had been in museums before. I had seen amazing things, priceless works of art as a young kid. But this was the first time that something personal, something that, was really in my world, I saw on display. I saw it amongst all of these other amazing artifacts. And it really, for the first time in my life, showed the power of what museums can do, of what it takes to preserve artifacts and share them with the general public. And it was such a memorable experience that I had that day at the American History Museum. I will never forget it. And every day that I go to work, I hope someone else has that Fonzie moment at one of my sites. I hope that they go there and they, have, it may be an object on display. It may be, the program, the person that they just heard speaking. Maybe it's as simple as they were walking the grounds, a grandfather with his granddaughter, and it was just a quiet moment that they got to share it together. But I want every person that comes to Historic Columbia, that comes to any of the properties that I've worked at, to have a memorable experience like I did that day at the Smithsonian. And I just think about that every single day. Now, I'd like to say that this was the moment I knew I wanted to be a director of operations. I knew I wanted to be an acting executive director. Well, that certainly is not true. It took me, many years and various kind of learning and academic career to try to get to this particular point where I came back to the museums. But I thought about that and I continue to think about that moment every single day. So to tell you a little bit about kind of my career, I started my career in 2007 at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. The Autry is one of the largest Western history museums in the country, has over 100 full-time employees, and incorporates what was originally the Gene Autry Museum, the Southwest Museum of the American Indian, and the Women of the West Museum. And the Autry National Center, as it was called when I was there, now referred to as the Autry Museum of the American West, was a fantastic education for someone coming into the museum world. Because we were such a large organization, because things were so regimented in regards to this team did this team did this, I had the opportunity not just to learn from some of the greatest museum professionals in that region, but I had the opportunity to kind of explore, to ask questions. Well, why are you doing things this way? Why are we doing it this way? What if we did this? And it really just gave me the opportunity at such a large organization to absorb so much information. And I think about that a lot. I think about the time that I was just able to sit and watch a designer do work. I was able to sit with a video editor and just see him go through the process. So really, it was a fantastic education to learn about museum operations from a world-class organization that had significant resources. I remained at the Autry Museum from 2007 to 2015. I started literally as an intern coming out of college at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And that's one of the questions people often ask is, how do you get started in the museum world? What do I need to do? And I first and foremost say, take any opportunity that you can. Take any opportunity, part-time job, paid internship. Unfortunately, not everyone can do an unpaid internship, but if you have that opportunity, please take advantage of it. It's getting your foot in the door that really makes the difference and is going to set you apart having that experience, even if it's part-time, even if it's an internship, working on those types of projects when you go to compete with other individuals, when you're looking for what are often very limited jobs in the museum field. So had the opportunity to rise through the ranks, starting as an intern to become a curatorial assistant, assistant curator, an associate curator, and then a full curator. Over time, I took on more responsibility, and by the time I left the Autry, my title was the Curator of Western History, Popular Culture, and Firearms, and I really looked at the broad history of the American American West from pre-contact all the way to the present through a variety of different lenses. And it was, again, a tremendous opportunity to learn so much about museum operations, how things should be done, and what needs to be done to truly, truly get your message out there in a variety of different mediums. But I quickly realized towards the back end of my career that I wanted to expand, I wanted to grow, and I wanted to be more than just a curator. I wanted to take on greater responsibility. I wanted to be involved in more operational aspects. So as a result, I made the difficult decision to leave Los Angeles and move to Farmington, New Mexico. And that is a rather sharp contrast going from the urban environment of Los Angeles, California, to the rather rural, desolate, 3 hours from the closest interstate, Farmington, New Mexico. But Farmington, while it is a small town in the Four Corners region of New Mexico, it had a very thriving and a very popularly supported municipal museum system, which was comprised of the Farmington Museum, the E3 Children's Museum. We also had the Riverside Nature Center. And while I was there, we opened the Museum of Navajo Art and Culture. So for a rather small town, we had a rather robust museum system. And this was a tremendous opportunity for me to take advantage of all of the things that I had learned at the Autry. We had a really small staff. So I went from 100 full-time employees to about 6 full-time employees. So we were doing so many different things. We were working on a variety of different projects and a variety of different roles. And it was really invigorating to have the opportunity to do this project, to do this project. What if we try this? What if we do that? So it was a tremendous way for me to implement all of the skills, all of the knowledge that I had learned at the Autry in a setting with not a lot of restrictions. I mean, we were a free museum, a municipal museum, so it gave us a lot of freedom to do some really interesting and engaging topics. So I spent from 2015 to 2019 at the Farmington Municipal Museum System. But as like any institution, the Farmington Municipal Museum System had challenges. Municipal museums are often tied to obviously the economics of that particular region, Farmington being a boom and bust, primarily gas, a little bit of oil, but primarily a gas industry area. And as a result of that, there was the opportunity, there was the opportunity for me to, again, continue my career in a different location and really going back to more operational aspects. So having learned so much and having had the opportunity to do so many curatorial things, but in a much larger setting where I am overseeing various staff members, education, design, curatorial. So there were so many different things that I oversaw. I now realized that I wanted to continue to expand, continue to grow, continue to learn more about museums. And in order to do that, I needed to go beyond just a curatorial role. So then in 2019, I had the opportunity to join the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, Georgia, which is just outside of Atlanta. The Southern Museum is known for the Great Locomotive Chase, 1862. A Southern railroad was stolen by Northern saboteurs in an attempt to drive it up to Chattanooga, and it took place just a few hundred yards from where that museum is currently located today. In the picture there, you can see the railroad tracks, the same railroad tracks that those saboteurs tried to steal the track or the railroad from, is still in operation today. So the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History, which is another municipal museum out of Kennesaw, Georgia, was a fantastic opportunity for me to really get into operational aspects of the organization, to look at not just kind of curatorial education and programs, but fundraising, marketing, design. There were so many different ways to approach a museum. There were so many different things. And having worked at the Autry as a curator, but having soaked up so much information, having had the opportunity in Farmington with a really small staff to expand and take on greater responsibility, and then really basically run the day-to-day operations of the Southern Museum of Civil War Locomotive History, gave me the tremendous opportunity to continue to grow, to continue to expand my knowledge and skill set as a museum professional, which then gave me the opportunity in 2022, when the Director of Operations, a newly created position at Historic Columbia, opened up. It was something that I immediately applied for because it knew a little bit larger organization, a little bit larger staff. It would allow me to continue to grow as a museum professional and take all of that skill, all of the knowledge that I had acquired over the years, and apply it in this really dynamic setting, which included things that I had never had the opportunity to be involved with, such as historic preservation, easements, things like that, that you traditionally don't do at a standard, what I like to refer to as a brick and mortar museum. And Historic Columbia Columbia is so much more than a museum. But having come from a museum background, this was, again, a tremendous opportunity to grow. So from there, I really want to now kind of talk to you about some projects that I've worked on, some things that really kind of have informed my career that for very notable reasons, and really kind of talk a little bit about that. So the first kind of topics that we're going to talk about are exhibits. So I had the opportunity to work on exhibits big and small throughout my career. I have done exhibits that really the cost of them was the printer paper for some of the labels, and that is it. Repurposed cases, objects in our collections, repurposed mounts. So I've done really kind of exhibits that have had a very minuscule budget to I worked on exhibitions that have been developed over roughly 5 years at a cost of $1 million. So in between that have been, case changeouts, object changeouts, gallery changeouts, the creation of a few new galleries, and actually the creation of an entire museum. So I've had seen different aspects from big to small of exhibitions. So I want to kind of talk to you about some of the notable ones that I've seen throughout my career. Early on at the Autry, I was the pop culture curator. So this was a Western history museum. So we did a lot about, Western television, Western movies. And you can think of the common names. This was obviously a museum established by America's favorite singing cowboy, Gene Autry. So we had the likes of Gene and Roy. We had John Wayne, Gary Cooper. All of those types of individuals were represented in our pop culture galleries. But I had the opportunity as I was kind of, expanding and learning people in the community and learning about collectors, that I came to learn about an object that was on display in an individual's office. And the object were the two intertwined shirts that in the last scene of the movie Brokeback Mountain, these are the two intertwined shirts that the characters had worn early on in the movie. And in the end, it is kind of the representation of their relationship and how they were forced to hide that relationship as a result of societal norms and the response that they got from people in their lives. And it's a really powerful object. It's immediately recognizable for those who are familiar with the film. And I came to learn that these objects were on display. A notable collector who had, someone I had learned about, had these objects, that he had acquired them at auction and that he was displaying them in his office. And given an introduction to him, I had the opportunity to meet with him and let him know that I worked at a Western history museum, and these objects really embody the American West, the idea of people trying to find their role in the American West, the idea of acceptance, the idea of exclusion, topics about the American West that we have been debating and we have been exploring for decades. And it really was a really powerful, emblematic of this particular community and their story in the American West. And I pitched the owner of these shirts that I want to put them on display, that I want the public to see them, that this is really something that needs to be shared with the public. It's such an iconic story. It's such an important movie in the history of the American West. And he was very receptive, and he listened. And it took a little bit of while. We had to go back and forth. You have to build those relationships. You have to build that trust. But ultimately, he agreed to put them on display at the Autry Museum. And as we were talking about how it was ultimately going to get displayed, his initial thought was, well, we're going to build a special case for them and we're going to put them on display by themselves and we're going to highlight that. And I said, no, that's certainly an option. We could certainly do that. It's such a notable story. There's such unique objects that would be appropriate. But I want to integrate this into the larger story of the American West. I don't want to show this as an aberration. I don't want to show this as a one-off. I want to show this as part of that narrative history in our imagination gallery that talks about the Western genre, about how this story, this community, the LGBTQ community in the American West, is part of the other stories that we've talked about, other individuals, again, making their way into the West, trying to build a community, the struggles that they faced. And he thought that was very interesting. And he said, I never really thought that we would incorporate those into one of your existing cases and put them on display with other objects. But as he thought about it more and we talked about it more, he understood that, again, making this part of the narrative and not the exception was really what we were striving to do. So we ended up putting these shirts on display in our contemporary Westerns case, alongside Chevy Chase's hat from Three Amigos, Clint Eastwood's outfit from The Unforgiven. I think there was a poster from Westworld. So really it was talking about all these different angles and all this different way that the Western genre had evolved before. And when we did the opening, when we did the unveiling of the shirts, we had people come from out the country to see these shirts on display. And a lot of these were especially were LGBTQ members of the Western community, and primarily cowboys, cowgirls, ranchers, and others who had been trying to, find their place in the American West and see where their story would be told. And they came, and I literally saw grown men cry. I mean, it was that Fonzie moment. It was the realization that these objects are having the same type of impact that that jacket. I'm not comparing the cultural or the significance of the two objects, but just the impact that as a little kid that jacket had on me, to the shirts, that the impact that they had on these individuals. And it reminded me of why I got into this industry, the power of what we can do, and just being very, very mindful of representation, and it's really about telling stories, but trying to tell stories. Sometimes you want to tell a broad story that includes as many people as possible. Sometimes you need to refine your story to tell about specific groups, often if they've been marginalized or overlooked. So really, these shirts were a powerful reminder to me about representation, that as a museum professional, we are keepers of the public trust, and we want to make sure that when we're telling stories, that we're telling inclusive stories, we're telling broad stories that can relate to many different people that come into our organizations, and the power of representation, and how it sometimes seems so simple, but putting two shirts on display as the representation for this community and the impact that it has. Again, it was one of those Fonzie moments that I will continue to go back to throughout my career and be very, very proud of. The culmination of my career at the Autry really was the Route 66 exhibit. This was the exhibit I referenced earlier that we developed over 5 years at a cost of just under $1 million. And I really think about kind of storytelling when I think about this particular exhibition. So Route 66, a really popular topic, something that's in the imagination that really doesn't go away, continues to be something that we see in pop culture and a variety of other settings. And when we said we wanted to do an exhibition on Route 66, there was many different ways that it could be approached. If you Google Route 66 or look up Route 66 in your local library, you'll see there'll be travel logs, there'll be books by state, there will be books about the cultural history of Route 66, there'll be books about the physical road itself and where it went and how it was designed and developed. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to tell both the history of the road and kind of the romance that came out of it. So our exhibition, Route 66, The Road and the Romance, talked about the actual road, what was taking place, why was it developed, why did it go the places that it did, and then in addition to that, to tell why it became so popular in popular culture in the larger American society almost immediately when the road was established. So this particular exhibition really contrasted a variety of different objects. We had some amazing world-class objects. We had John Steinbeck's original draft, handwritten draft for the Grapes of Wrath, John Ford's Academy Award. We had Jack Kerouac's On the Road scroll, the scroll that he wrote, taped out the entire first draft of On the Road, that was on display. Bobby Troup, who wrote the Route 66 song, his map that he used to drive across Route 66. The song was actually based on his experience with his first wife. We had the map that they used to go across the country. We had works of art, notable photographs, Woody Guthrie's guitar. I mean, there was just so many objects in this particular exhibition. But again, contrasting these iconic items with mass-produced things, with things that people would have encountered in hotels and rest stops and other things along the road, to really tell that larger story. So when we think about doing exhibitions, when we think about doing programs and other things, it's about storytelling. It's about how we're telling those stories. What stories are we choosing to tell, and what are we choosing to focus on when we do tell those stories? And the Route 66 exhibition for me really was very, very powerful, because it juxtaposed those really iconic objects with things that people would have come across, people would have experienced. And I think it really created a really really thorough understanding of what the road meant in American society in the 20th century. And I was really, really proud to work on this and to bring all of those elements together. And as you look at this picture that's on your screen of that, it wasn't just the objects themselves, but the graphics. You can see the another roadside attraction, the graphics that which changed colors when you went into different sections. We had keywords that would be referenced throughout. Just the sheer process of getting that Corvette into the gallery was a lot of fun because the gallery was not specifically designed to fit a vehicle of that particular size, and that Corvette is a little bit smaller. So again, it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to hone my storytelling and really use world-class, amazing objects to do so in a very powerful setting. But then when I moved to the Farmington Municipal Museum System, I went from an organization, the Autry, where we had the opportunity to develop exhibitions over years at a cost of $1 million, to where the Farmington Municipal Museum System was where, again, we had an industrial printer, which was often the backbone of a lot of the exhibitions that we did. So I was able to go from an exhibition where you're doing everything, you're pouring as much money into it as you possibly can, to go really what I refer to as kind of guerrilla museums. And it was really about guerrilla exhibit design, guerrilla exhibit curation. We would take anything that we could get our hands on. We would, if people offered us objects, if people had things to loan, we had such a small budget. It was really about finding ways to use those very, very limited resources in truly dynamic ways. So one of the opportunities that came to us was the Albuquerque Natural History Museum was renovating their lobby. And at the New Mexico Association of Museums, we learned of this, and they said, well, we have Stan in the lobby, and we're considering maybe loaning him out. We immediately jumped on that. This was a casting of Stan, the famous T-Rex, and this was something that obviously our museum could not afford to purchase a casting of this type, and to have the ability to put this on display at no cost through the generous support of the Natural History Museum there in Albuquerque. We jumped at this, and one of the first things we realized, we didn't even know if it could fit when we agreed to do it. If you look at the picture, you can see his tail is actually making its way up into the rafters, and we were lucky that we had that additional space. But it's this idea of, regardless of whether you're at a museum big or you're a museum small, you need to adapt to the circumstances surrounding you. You need to figure out, what resources do we have? Sometimes you have money, but you don't have staff. Sometimes you have staff, but you don't have money. Sometimes you don't have either one. But how, again, are you going to live up to your expectations? How are you going to continue to deliver to the public world-class exhibitions, even in a smaller location like Farmington, New Mexico? So for us, it was about making connections, working with the community, taking advantage, again, of any resource that we had offered to us, and Stan was that perfect example. Dinosaurs are super popular. It's kind of the one universal in museums, and we put Stan on display. We juxtaposed it with a Petroliana, oil and gas memorabilia exhibition, which really worked out well because a lot of people think oil and gas comes from dinosaurs. It does not. But that thinking, it allowed us to kind of introduce that as the juxtaposition or the introduction from one exhibit to the other. So again, a really, really great opportunity to take advantage, to be adaptable when those situations arise, regardless of your setting. The last one I want to talk to you about is the Museum of Navajo Art and Culture. And, I talked about representation when I talked about Brokeback Mountain, but equally important to representation is agency. And it's about making sure that, the people that you're talking about have a voice. They have a say in the exhibitions that you're putting on, that the exhibits that you are putting on. So when we had the opportunity, when a former trading post in downtown Farmington, New Mexico was donated to the city with the intent of creating a new museum, a Museum of Navajo Art and Culture, Farmington, New Mexico borders the Navajo Nation, that we wanted to make sure that we were telling this story in an appropriate manner. And what that meant was we weren't telling the story. So we stepped back and said, these are the objects we have in our collection, working with indigenous community leaders, representatives from various groups, different artists. We said, here's the things that we have in our collection. Here are some of the things that we would be able to borrow to put this exhibition together, to create this museum, and really working with the indigenous local community, working with the Navajo people to make sure that we were telling the appropriate stories. We were telling the right stories. And again, we weren't telling them from our perspective, but we were allowing them to drive the narrative, giving them the agency to do so. So our first exhibition in this brand new museum was called Patterns from Places, which talked about Navajo weaving and how Navajo weaving designs were a combination of many factors, including the traders and at the individual trading posts, but also the weavers in those areas and how they juxtapose individual designs of different areas, different groups, and how that came about in these different weavings. So it used our collection that we had, the resources that we had, but the Navajo representatives, the Navajo leaders and advisors were the ones that ultimately were able to drive this narrative and make sure that we were telling the stories that were appropriate and the ones that they wanted to tell, along with the ones that we thought should be told as well. So what you're looking at here is a SketchUp. SketchUp at the time was a free open source platform that allowed you to do design. And this was one that was, you know, I had the opportunity. We went in there, we're measuring everything, we're doing all this. This is, again, don't have a lot of resources, but this was a free program that we had and we could do this. And you might not be able to see, but I think it's really, really important to note that I went out of the way also to design the chair. If you look at the desk, that kind of circular thing, that was the desk that was in there. I designed the chair too. Don't ask me why. That is not important, but I'm looking at that now going, that probably took me a lot of time, but I was so adept or so adamant about wanting to get every aspect of the building right that I actually put the chair in there as well. I think that's a little bit of funny. But again, it's not just about representation, but it's also about agency. And the Museum of Navajo Art and Culture in Farmington, New Mexico, I think is something that is emblematic of that. Now, switching a little bit to donations and talking about kind of some of the objects that I've had the opportunity to work with throughout my career, I'm going to start with a case number 5 holster model set. These are commonly referred to as Texas Pattersons. These firearms, as I believe I mentioned earlier, at one point I was a firearms curator at the Autry. So as my knowledge grew and as my responsibilities grew, I took on new topics, and firearms were something that I found very, very fascinating. Frederick Jackson Turner, who's a notable historian of the American West, once said that the 3 tools in the settlement of the American West were the axe, the plow, and the firearm. Now, that is, of course, a very simplified overview of the West, and Frederick Jackson Turner's work has been rightly critiqued over the last decades because of his simplistic views and how his biases in his understanding of the American West. But it does get at the fact that firearms were important. Firearms were an integral tool in the settlement of the American West. They were an integral tool in the defense of the American West by Native Americans. So as a firearms curator at the Autry, we had a world-class collection. We had one of the best Colt collections in the country. We had probably the best Western firearms collection in the country. And I was very successful in getting more people to donate firearms to the museum. And we revamped our Colt gallery. We had a dedicated Colt gallery. We revamped that. We had a very generous donation that allowed us to revamp an old area that had a very kind of stale interactive that we completely turned it into a new gallery and created a gallery that talked about the evolution of firearms in the American West and the impact that they had in various times. But we had done so much stuff with firearms when a gentleman by the name of Dennis Levesque came into our orbit, and we started talking to him about kind of doing new objects. He had the finest the finest Colt Patterson collection in the country. Colt Pattersons are a very specific type of Colt revolver. When we started talking to him about exhibits and about maybe borrowing some of his or donations and things along those lines, the key thing for me was, how am I going to contextualize these? I mean, really, we've just put so many firearms on display over the last, few years that really just putting more firearms on display was not something that the organization wanted. And quite simply, it was not something that I wanted. But in researching these objects and looking into them, what we came to find was there was a much larger story to tell. And this particular set of guns is emblematic of a battle that took place in 1844. It's called the Battle of Walker's Creek. It was in the Republic of Texas. And it was one of the first times that repeating firearms were used in battle. And it was approximately 70 Texas Rangers led by Captain Jack Hayes up against 70 to 80 Comanche at that particular time. And the 15 Texas Rangers were able to hold off the 80 Comanche because they had these new innovative weapons, which was with these repeating firearms. Prior to that, bows and arrows were much more successful, much more powerful on the American frontier than firearms were, because firearms just were not very adequate at that point. And as a result of these new firearms, firearms, which were very powerful, which were multi-shot, which is what made the Colt revolver so unique. These firearms then became the basis to really see the tip in the balance of power between white Anglo settlers and natives across the frontiers of the American West. So whereas before, and more recent scholarship talks about this, we've talked about the history of the American West as kind of an inevitable manifest destiny for so many years, but there were multiple points in times where the history of the American West could have dramatically changed, and the introduction of these types of firearms was one of them. So that's what we wanted to tell with this story. We wanted to tell about their role in this balance of power. So we wanted to juxtapose these weapons against the weapons that were more powerful that had been used by Native Americans for decades prior to this particular time. So again, this was someone who, this collector, the individual who was willing to donate these objects, he wanted to tell a very specific story. So it was incumbent upon us to say why we need to contextualize these objects, why we want to put them on display, but to tell a broader, more kind of inclusive story when it comes to the history of the American West. And just like with Brokeback Mountain, these donors have very preconceived ideas about how their objects should be displayed. So it's really up to us as museum professionals to build that relationship, build that rapport to where ultimately we can come to an agreement on how the best way for both the organization and the donor to put these types of objects on display. So really contextualization is something that I think of when I think about a lot of the firearms displays and exhibits that we did at the Autry, because that's what it was really about, contextualizing those weapons to tell a much larger story. Now, I was a pop culture curator at the Autry as well, so we did a lot of things related to the Western genre, and you might not be exactly sure what you're looking at. Yes, this is a saddle, but it is a little unique. This is Roy Rogers' plastic saddle. It was made by the All Westerns Plastics out of Lusk, Wyoming in 1951, and this object was on display for many years at the Roy Rogers Museum. Roy Rogers Museum was in Victorville, California, then it went to Branson, Missouri, and ultimately, the museum closed. It was really about Roy Rogers. We talked about contextualization just a second ago, and Roy Rogers created a museum just about Roy. So as Roy's followers and fans got older, the museum wasn't as popular anymore, so it ultimately forced to close. Gene Autry took a different tack when he created his museum and created it about the American West, not about himself. That museum is still in operation to this day. So when the Roy Rogers Museum closed, we really wanted to, the Autry staff, and we wanted to get some things from that to represent Roy. We had objects related to Roy, but Gene and Roy are often talked about together, so we wanted to build our collection related to Roy Rogers objects. This particular saddle, these plastic saddles, and Roy had a handful of them, were very unique. Only, I want to say 30, I think, are still known to be in existence to this day, and we certainly did not have anything like this in our collection. When we purchased the saddle, we purchased it at auction. It was represented as Roy Rogers' Rose Parade saddle. You can see the dozens of hand-painted yellow and red roses that you find on this. What we came to find out was this saddle actually had very little connotation to the Tournament of Roses. So when I think of this particular saddle, it's about do your research. What do they say? Trust but verify. So we acquired the saddle because it was Roy Rogers, because it was a plastic saddle, not necessarily because of its direct connection to the Tournament of Roses. But as we started to do more research about it, we found out things that the Roy Rogers Museum, if they knew, they hadn't put on display. For example, we found out this saddle was not created for Roy. It was actually created for the president of the company. When Roy became a corporate spokesman, he asked to have this saddle because it was the best of all of the saddles that the company had made, so they gave it to him. Roy put it in a case, and Roy took it to various locations across the country, including, we believe, one time the Tournament of Roses, but he never actually rode this one. We have no pictures of him riding it. We have no pictures of him at the Tournament of Roses parade. Working with the archivist at the Tournament of Roses, we watched every video of Roy Rogers that they had in their collection. He's never on this plastic saddle. He's on a different plastic saddle, but not this particular one. So when I think of this, again, it's about research. When you have these objects, oftentimes you're going to have a file. It's going to talk about the donor. It's going to talk about years, but you still need to do your due diligence. You need to look into these things. You need to verify. You need to check this type of information, because I believe when we first got it, we were, again, going to put it on display as saying this is his Tournament of Roses. As we learn more about it, we were able to provide a much broader story related to this particular saddle. And it reminds us, you've got to do your research and stay on top of these things to make sure your information is correct. Another notable object that I was able to acquire for the Autry Museum was the map to illustrate the Ponderosa in Nevada. Many of you may be familiar of this map. We surmise that this is the most viewed map in world history. And the reason we surmise that is this map began and was shown at the beginning of every Bonanza episode. If you may recall, if you were a Bonanza fan, you saw the map of the Ponderosa. It caught on fire, and as the map slowly burned, the Cartwright boys made their way into frame and slowly started coming into it. Because that show was on the air for so many years, because that show was one of the most popular shows on American programming, including around the world, again, we surmise that this is probably the most viewed map in world history. What's interesting about this particular map, though, again, is talking about doing your research, looking into these types of things. We came to find that it was created by Robert Temple Ayers. Robert Temple Ayers was a studio artist for the studio of the production company, and he was tasked with creating a map that may be used for promotion of the television show. And when David Dortort, who was the creator of Bonanza, saw the map completed for the first time, he said, "It's beautiful, I love it, but it's wrong." And Robert Temple Ayers was like, "What do you mean it's wrong? It's great, it looks nice." And he was like, "Yes." He was like, "But every map has north pointing to the top. You have north off in an angle, kind of to the northwest." He's like, "That's not how maps are oriented." So Robert Temple Ayers said, "Okay." And he drew a compass and he reoriented north to correct for the mistake. And he said, "Now your map is fixed. There you go." So it was an interesting story that we learned a part of it. But what we also learned is that Robert Temple Ayers over the years had lost connection to the map. Again, this was a studio artist who was paid to create this, had no association with the show, and really had no ownership, obviously, as a paid employee of the organization to this. And he had lost touch with it. He wasn't sure where it was. He thought it had been with David Dortort or David Dortort's family. And after David Dortort passed and this map was donated to the Autry Museum, there was an obituary, a story about David Dortort and talk about the donation of the map. And Robert Temple Ayers' family reached out to the Autry and said, "What we found amazing was not just that we found the map, but you had credited our father as the artist of the map." They said in almost 50 years, we had never seen his name directly tied by an outside organization to the map. Not just that, Robert Temple Ayers was still alive. He was getting to an older age at that particular point, but the family was able to bring him to the Autry. He was able to sit in front of the map and look at his most famous creation that he had not seen directly for so many years. And he was able to see the map, view it again. So it's a reminder when we do these types of things that we need to give credit to these individuals who created these objects, the individuals who saved these objects, preserved these objects, and of course, the individuals who donated these objects. And in this particular case, it was David and Rose Dortort. One last kind of donation that I just want to bring to your attention because I think it is very, very notable. And that is the, as a result of the Brokeback Mountain exhibition, their exhibit that we put on display, we had, as I mentioned, many cowboys come in and talk to us about they didn't know that their story would be told in a setting like this. They thought this was a traditional standard Western history museum that would exclude their stories. And when they saw and realized that that's not what the Autry was about, it was about telling broader, more inclusive stories, they came to us and said, "We have been struggling for years to preserve the archives of the International Gay Rodeo Association. We don't have a staff. We have very little money. So as a result of that, would this be something that you would even consider?" And of course it was. We had several archives. That was a major part of what we did at the Autry. But this was the idea of this group truly did not believe that their collection, that their story would be told in a setting like that. So you always want to challenge expectations. You want to make sure that you're thinking of the community in which you are serving. And this was a perfect example. Had we never done the Brokeback exhibit, we would have never opened ourselves to be seen as this type of welcoming organization that would allow things like the International Gay Rodeo Association to have a home at the Autry. So it just reminds me, you need to challenge expectations and make sure that you're looking at that larger community. I am mindful of our time, and I know I'm getting quick, so I'm going to rush through these, and I do apologize. So some of the notable events or programs that I've had the opportunity to work on. When I was at the Autry, working with staff saying, what don't we do? Where is there a niche that we need to fill? We learned that there was nothing in Los Angeles, the film capital of the world. There was no film series devoted specifically to Westerns. So we started a film series devoted to Westerns. I am happy to report that that film series that I established 15 years ago is still in existence today in Los Angeles. You can still go see a monthly Western movie movie at the Autry. And one of the other things, thinking about our location, serving our audience, these were cinephiles, so we made sure that every movie that we showed was in 35 millimeter. It was something that they really bought into. So it's really, really about knowing not just your audience, but taking advantage of opportunities. This was something no one was doing, so we started doing it. When I made my way to the Farmington Municipal Museum System, one of the first questions I was asked was, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do? And that's something that I ask all of my staff. What are you passionate about? What do you want to do? And clearly, I think you might say I'm passionate about Western history. So when I went to Farmington, they said, what do you want to do? I said, well, I love Western history. I love talking about Western history. What if we create a curator's choice Western series where we talk about all these different topics and, things like that? And that's what we did. And that was a very, very popular monthly series that we had in Farmington. We had a small room that we were able to do it, often sold out. But again, it tapped into my passion. It engaged me every single day. So it's something that I try to think about. Conversely, when I made my way to the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, Georgia, our most popular program was Mommy and Me. And upon doing additional research into our membership and our visitation, we came to learn that the majority of our people were coming for Mommy and Me and other types of programming. They weren't coming for exhibits. They weren't coming for our other programs. So as a result of knowing who our audience was and knowing what they wanted, we really put a lot of time and effort into further developing the Mommy and Me, changing out the schedule more often, giving more resources to it. Because again, we learned this is what our audience wanted. So knowing who your audience is and what they want is certainly important in a museum setting. Equally important is education. And we would do a variety of programs, not just for school kids and toddlers, but also for adults as well. Homeschool Workshop Series was one of these. We did that during the school year. We would do brain train outside of the school year, which was, again, another educational opportunity packaged in a different way. So those kids didn't think they had to do school during the summer year hours. So education should always be at the forefront of everything we do, knowing what our audience is. Now, I've had the opportunity to speak in a variety of different settings. I've talked to groups big, I've talked to groups small, and really it's about engaging any audience that is interested in what you're doing. So I've said, I don't mind speaking in front of an auditorium in front of 100 people. I'll also go to a classroom and speak to 5 people. It really does not matter. It's about getting our message out there any way that we possibly can. That includes oftentimes going to other organizations. I've been lucky enough to be a commentator, to do docent training, to speak to staffs at museums across the country. What you're seeing here is I was able to do a program and do some training at the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum for a traveling exhibition that I had put together called Cowboys and Presidents. The Cowboy Hall, I did some docent training there. Went to the Mark Twain House and did a talk there about the Colt Revolver. So it's really about going to different places and sharing your expertise in as many ways as you possibly can, which sometimes does include going on television and doing some of those shows. So this is a shot of me behind the scenes for Pawn Stars. I've had the opportunity to go on television. Rachel did a few of those in the introductions. But why I think these are important, because again, it is expanding your audience. It's getting your message out to a variety of different people. And anecdotally, I would have a lot of people come up to me and say, oh, I saw you on Pawn Stars, or I saw you on this, which brought me to the museum. And that's what we were trying to do. It wasn't about getting me out there. It wasn't about anything like that. It was about expanding the reach of these organizations and letting people know what we have. And one of those engaging ways to do those is a lot of these historical programs that take place. Conversely, outside of my work, I've also had the opportunity to do some of my own passion projects. And one of those, my second book, was on Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was someone that I researched beginning as a college student. My master's thesis talked about RKO Studios, which he owned at one point. And I had all of this research material that I lugged from state to state. And I was really resilient that I was never going to get rid of it. I'm going to use it one day. And I took it from Nevada to California to New Mexico. And it was in New Mexico, when I lugged these things around all this time, that someone had the opportunity. I was working with a publisher on a different project, and I pitched this to them, and they said we would do it. So it's really about perseverance. It's about making sure that if you're passionate about something, you're dedicated, you stick with it. But what's the most important lesson that I have learned in all of this? It's not about me. It's not about the organization. It's about the team. It's about the people. And that is the single most important thing that I take from my many travels, working at museums, municipal, private. It's really the organization is comprised of the people. And the people, first and foremost, are the staff, but it's also the donors. It's you folks who participate in programs, continue to support us in a variety of ways. But that is what makes up the difference, because I can tell you, having worked with $1 million artifacts, working with an industrial printer, having done a variety of different exhibits, programs, donations, at the end of the day, if you do not have a passionate and engaged staff, nothing will proceed in the way that you want to. So that is the single most important lesson that I have learned throughout my career, is to think about the staff, engage the staff, find ways to give them agency, find ways to make them passionate every single day about the types of things that they do, and really think about not just what is, engaging to them. What is their Fonzie moment? What is the moment that drives them to come to work every single day? And that is something that I think about as a director of operations, and I am thinking about every single day in my role as acting executive director. We're going to open it up here in a second we have a little bit of time for questions. So we're going to open that up here now for a few questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for sharing and presenting about your career. At this time, we are going to open up the floor to questions. So if any participant has any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat now. I have a couple that I'd love to start with. So I'm sure, Jeffrey, in your career, you've been involved with a lot of different programs. So aside from obviously this installment of Knowledge at Noon, what was the program that you enjoyed working on the most, and why was it successful?
I'm gonna, I have had the opportunity to work on a variety of programs. The more recent one I used to do a huge trains at the Southern Museum, where we would put all these sorts of model trains in the exhibit, and to see kids running around and doing all that. That's, again, it's the Fonzie moment. It's seeing those smiles on their faces. The one thing I would say, the one program I would say that I am the most proud of is that What is a Western Film Series? And the reason for that is we created it from scratch. It is ongoing. I think it's in its 15th year. It is still a monthly program. It is still very, very popular. And what I loved about it is, part of my job, I got to sit and watch Western movies. So I'd watch Western movies on the clock. I'd learn about them. I'd research them. And it was really, really fantastic. And, for someone who loves film, who loves the American West, it was a wonderful convergence of driving my passion, finding a passionate audience, and a program, as we talked about in the presentation, a program that no one else was doing and really resonated with the audience that we were trying to tap into. So I'm very proud of that program and that it continues to this day, slightly modified, but I'm really excited that it still exists.
That's amazing to hear. Very cool program. I think all of us would have liked to have seen that in our time. One question we just got from the audience is, you've gotten to watch a lot of Western movies during your career, during your research. Which one's your favorite?
That is actually, I was asked one time by the Los Angeles Times. I was a guest contributor to the Los Angeles Times, and I wrote an article on the 5 best Western movies of all time. And I'm trying to remember exactly what 5 that I said for that. I believe it was The Wild Bunch, Unforgiven, Blazing Saddles. I'm missing 2 more in that particular one. There are a lot of Western movies. Ride the High Country was one, not as well known, that I like. There are some parts of it that don't age well that really bother me to this day. So as a result, I have trouble putting that to the forefront of things like that. But I will answer it in another way and say, when I was, again, a young man, a lot of my knowledge of history, my love of history comes from my father. And I think the only Western movie that I saw in theater, maybe with the exception of Young Guns 2, but that's not really a movie. With the exception of that, was Unforgiven. And I saw Unforgiven in the theater with my father, and that holds a special place for me, because it was a Western movie at a time when I didn't like Westerns, when I didn't like anything about that. It was a Western movie that I very enjoyed, and I remember seeing it in the theater with my father, so it holds a particular place in my heart.
Well, that's a very sweet way for us to close out our program, though. Thank you for sharing that. So we are very happy to provide programs such as this for no charge, but we are very appreciative of any monetary donations that are able to be made towards Historic Columbia. And you can make these through our website at any time. There's a link in the chat, and there's also a QR code that is going to be placed on the screen here. So thank you again, Jeffrey, for hosting this lovely lecture about your career and your current time at Historic Columbia. For everyone who is listening, please stay tuned to our events page on our website, as well as to subscribe to our newsletter in order to get some information on upcoming segments in this series, including the presentation topics and our speakers for our next installments of Knowledge at Noon. That being said, please join us on September 4th, when we will sit down with Sherard Shakis Duvall for our next installment of Knowledge at Noon, which is going to be featuring Duvall's family ties and his history as they relate to Columbia. This does include the Wheeler Hill neighborhood, and it really does a good job of explaining why his connection empowers his support and his work with HC's Jubilee Festival of Black History and Culture. That program will be held virtually on September 4th at noon. Registration is free, and it is now live on our website. You will receive a post-event email later today, along with a recording of this program and a link to sign up for next month's Knowledge at Noon. That being said, thank you again to Jeffrey, and thank you for all participants for tuning in today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and you stay safe in this weather. Thank you.